identify risk, a process which gives us list of the risk. Can we do it at once? No. It's an iterative process, and sometimes it is part of other knowledge areas also. When I am writing scope, when I am thinking about a cost estimate, I may identify some risks, or I may conduct special meetings which are dedicated to identifying risk out of my project activities. What all input we would be needing to identify risk? Almost everything. Whatever we do in project, whatever documents which we prepare in a project has a possibility of hiding some risks. And we also need to remember, if we miss identifying risk, we miss the complete process. Only the identified risk get planned in a risk response strategy, and only the identified risk we think of while we think of contingency reserves. So if we miss identifying risk, we miss factoring that particular risk in our project budget, be it time or cost. So it's a very important activity. Another thing, it's easy to identify generic risk. For example, we may have an iteration in a project. The customer may not sign off in a given timelines. Such kind of generic risks are coming from your organization process assets and easy to identify. But the risks which are specific to your project will require real analysis and expert judgment to get identified. So let's look at input, tools and techniques, and output of identify risk. As I said, lot of things contributes to risk identification. So we have a long list and inputs. So we can categorize this list into plans. So we need a risk management plan, we need a cost management plan, we need a schedule management plan, we need a quality management plan, and we need human resource plan. Are the other plans are not relevant? They are. And in some way they are getting included. But these are the primary one which we need to consider. Let's look at a scope or estimate related inputs. They are scope baseline, and we do estimation of duration and estimation of cost, time and cost at an activity level. So we need a duration and cost inputs from which is coming from activity cost estimate and activity duration estimate. Now, what else? Let's talk about stakeholders, their needs. So we need an input as stakeholder register, because we need to interview, discuss and identify risks which they can visualize, but we may not be able to identify it just looking at documents. Now we need to look at documents. A project document. Now we have a long list of project documents, activities, issue logs, everything goes into a project document. Even the risk register is a part of project document. So we look at all the project documents and try to identify hidden risks from it. We also look at procurement documents. Now what else? We have looked at plan, we have looked at some of our estimate, scope baseline, activity duration estimate, activity cost estimate, stakeholder register, project and procurement documents. After that, we need to look at enterprise environmental factor, because some environment is bringing a type of risk. So if you are working in a night shift, a part of your organization is working in a night shift, it will bring a set of risks. If you have good amount of part-time resources, it may bring a set of risk. Organization, process, asset, checklists, lesson learned, risk register from previous project, all come from organization, process, assets. So this makes a total 13 inputs. I would recommend not to memorize it, but visualize. You need a planning input, you need a documentation input, and you also need input whenever you are doing any estimate or you are documenting any assumption. We need a scope baseline because we document assumptions, constraints in scope baseline. And scope also represents some kind of risky areas, so which would be required while identifying risks. So let's look at tool and technique. Since we have good amount of documents, we need to review them. So first tool and technique for identifying risk is review the documents which you have collected. A documentation review. By looking at these documents, we can identify the risky areas, the assumptions, some estimate accuracies or inaccuracies, variances. So this helps us in identifying risk. Since we cannot identify risk just by looking at documents, we also need to gather information. So we need to talk to stakeholders, we need to talk to the project team members, we need to talk to sponsor and try to gather information which can help us in identifying risk. So information gathering is another tool and technique. So how do we do that? We may apply a brainstorming, we may apply Delphi technique, a techniques which helps us to extract information from group of individuals. Interviewing, we may apply a root cause analysis. Now, what else? We can do a checklist analysis. From where we are getting those checklists? Organization, process, assets. So, the third tool and technique which we apply is checklist analysis. Now, if the organization has a mature risk management process, they may have a good amount of checklists which can help us in identifying risks. But as a project team members, you should not only rely on checklists but also put your own mind. As I said in my previous discussion, a project specific risks requires your own judgment, because this checklist may not be able to give you a project specific risk. It can give you a risk like, if you have a part-time resources, look for these risks, because they keep occurring when they have a part-time resources like communication breakdown, people taking off without informing, etc., etc. If you have a particular exchange rate issue, for example, if you are dealing in a multiple currencies, you may have an exchange rate fluctuation risk. So those all things can come from checklist analysis. And they are also helpful because we may miss identifying few risks if we don't have this checklist. The risk breakdown structure or risk category also get used along with the checklist analysis. They also helps us in visualizing and identifying risks. Fourth tool and technique, assumption analysis. Now, we made good amount of assumptions while we were documenting scope. We also made assumptions while we were estimating activity duration and when we were estimating cost estimates for an activity. Now, these assumptions always has a possibility of going wrong. And if these assumptions goes wrong, they will impact the project. For example, if while writing a scope, I am making that this particular component I assume is provided by the vendor or by the customer. If customer says that this component is no more available now, yeah, it was initial assumption, we were thinking that we can provide you, but since we have not committed, we think now we cannot provide it. It's a risk. So all the assumptions should be analyzed and tracked in the form of risk, because if they goes wrong, you are in a trouble. What else? You may apply some diagrammatical techniques. Now, you may think that there are so many techniques in risk identification. Identifying risk is more or less similar to identifying a requirement, because we are trying to put our mind and extract something which is not readily available. And it will require techniques like information gathering and diagrammatical analysis. So we apply a technique called diagrammatical. Now these diagramming techniques helps us in visualizing the problem by using diagrams. Like cause and effect diagram or a fishbone diagram. Like influence diagram, where we can see an impact of one variable on another. Influence diagram. Another possible is flowcharts. You can use a system flowchart or you can use a process flowchart. So system/process flowchart. By using these techniques, you are trying to visualize your requirements, your way of doing things, your development process maybe, and trying to identify that in this particular development process, where all things can go wrong. You may be identifying a root cause of some previous problem and try to identify how this can possibly affect in a future time, and that will contribute to a risk register. You may document it as a part of risk. Another technique which you can use is strength, weakness, opportunity, threat analysis. In SWOT, you try to identify a project strengths, weaknesses, and opportunity and threats. Now, threats, weaknesses will go towards negative risk. Strength and opportunity may goes towards positive risk. So if you have some strengths, you may want to exploit them further. You think that, okay, you have few technical resources which are exceptional. You may try to utilize them at max, so that the strength and opportunity will move towards a positive risk which you can exploit. If you have a threat, if you think that some event, a rain or an exchange rate fluctuation can impact or derail your project, that also goes into a negative risk. And this all cannot be done without expert judgment. You don't have a defined thing that you check, the risk statement will get produced. Somebody has to put his mind in identifying risk using all this technique, and that's why the expert judgment is an important tool and technique for risk identification. On this good amount of documents, we applied good amount of techniques, and finally we got a risk register. you can visualize a kind of list which has risks listed. Risks should be listed in a given format. You should try to enforce a template or a structure for your risk statement. It could be that if this event happen, it can result in this effect. Or it could be that if because of this cause, this event can happen and it can possibly affect the project in this particular way. Having a structure for a risk statement helps team to identify right risk and pick the key element or the key pointers which are necessary to do a further analysis. So in a risk register, we have a risk statement like this. After that, we may also have a risk category. If we have used assumption, the checklist, we already know the risk breakdown structure, we may map the risk in category. While identifying, we may be knowing the causes. We may be knowing the possible response. So these kind of information can be, we can also document a possible impact. Now these things will be further refined when we do a risk assessment, but at the identification level, whatever information is available, we should document in a risk register. So in summary, identify risk is a process which gives us a risk register, and we will use this risk register in rest of our project risk management processes.